Hello and welcome. I'm Becky with Malvern Books. We're thrilled to be hosting this event celebrating the publication of Alex Z Salinas' new short story collection, City Lights from the Upside Down. We're very happy to also welcome back Harold Whit Williams to the reading as well. We're going to be starting with Harold, and then we'll be following up with Alex after that. Harold Whit Williams is a prize-winning poet and longtime guitarist for the indie rock band Cotton Mather. The author of 5 books and poetry, Williams lives in Austin, Texas, where he records lo-fi music as daily worker and catalogs a KUT collection for the University of Texas Libraries. Mel Bay's Book of the Dead is his first book of short stories. Harold?
Thanks, Becky.
Whichever river I dream, I can't find the current midstream. I wake up to my own screams. I miss the world as it was. Those lights that smoke the low buzz. Turn up to crank the old fuzz. Everything's a haze, these half-lit days. This place, this moment I've known, I'm feeling less than homegrown. What's taught, what's told, and what's shown. I miss the world as it was. Those lights that smoke the low buzz. Turn up to crank the old fuzz. Melancholia, everything's a haze. These half-lit days. Melancholia, 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 melancholia. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. All right. I'd like to start off with a little rock and roll. Thank you so much for tuning in. That was Melancholia from my Daily Worker Shelter and Tape series, Shelter and Tapes Volume 5, exclusive to Bandcamp, dailyworkerbandcamp.com if you're curious, want to go check it out. Thank you to Malvern for hosting this, Becky and Joe and everybody there. You guys are wonderful. And especially thank you to Alex. I'm thrilled to be reading with you again. I read with him in San Antonio back in October at the Twig, and just had a blast. And I'm just looking forward to hearing more from you. Alex and I are both published by the awesome San Antonio Review Press, and then thanks and big shout out to the mighty William Pate for his love and support. And my latest collection, as Becky said, is Mel Bay's Book of the Dead, from San Antonio Review Press, collection of short stories. There are some copies at Malvern, some signed author copies. So get them while they last. And I did a wonderful book event with them back last summer for Mel Bay. I'm kind of calling an audible here. I want to keep things rolling here and get to the main event, and get to Alex. But calling an audible, I'm going to read a brand new short story. Not brand new. I've been working on it for a couple of months, early drafts. But I thought I'd trot it out tonight and see what you guys think of it. Title is Father's Day, Dauphin Island. Within minutes, a wind kicks up and the sky to the southwest darkens. Palm-sized raindrops patter the chop around them, the chop already turning into low swells. The wind now a steady gust. Lightning strikes the Gulf not a mile away, the air smelling like a blown fuse. The man and his son had just pushed their kayaks off of the sandbar island moments earlier, a little dot just to the south of Dauphin Island, a good spot for birding or sunbathing or meditation. The two of them had shared peanut butter sandwiches and fig Newtons and colas, and had spent the afternoon goofing off and talking and scanning the skies for frigate birds. Sometimes a frigate would stray north from Cuba or the Yucatan this time of year. Their massive wingspan, rarely flapping at all, gave them away. No frigates to be seen today, though, just the usual brown pelicans and laughing gulls and terns, and ospreys circling back near the state pier. But it had been a beautiful afternoon nonetheless before the sky darkened. The man thrilled to have one-on-one time with his son, a mid-June afternoon, mild and pleasant. Just a 10% chance of thunderstorms. Folks around Mobile Bay not even batting an eye to anything under 50%, as 50% always means, yes, it will storm. But what kind of storm? The man always thinks. That's the real concern. Who pays attention to percentages? It storms down here all the time. But a dry summer spell can fool a person, can lull a person into being inattentive. That false sense of security people have in other quieter parts of the country. Another lightning strike, much closer this time. The man, still fit in his late 40s, now pumps his oars furiously in the chop. The boy, thin arms, sinewy and muscled from junior high wrestling, watches his father closely and does the same. The rumble of thunder, all-encompassing, magnificently loud. The man feels his skull rattle like an old window pane. Too late to turn back to the sandbar, he thinks, as it'll probably be overtaken by the swells anyway. And never mind the lightning strikes out there. He yells at his son, "Come on, move it." The pattering raindrops turn into a heavy downpour, as if suddenly the man and his son are underneath some giant waterfall. Lightning popping again to the south, the rolling boom of thunder almost now continuous. The man puts his head down, facing the kayak's front, and starts a manic pace, pumping his oars. "Come on," he yells again, his voice all but lost in the roar of the rain and the rumbling thunder. The boy right behind him falls in line with the pace. The man glances up for a moment. He can just barely make out Dauphin Island, the beach, the state pier. It's all almost blotted from view by sheets of rain, his own vision blurred from the water pouring upon him and the salt spray stinging his eyes. "Oh Lord," he prays, "get us safely to that beach." He sees, or thinks he sees, a lone person out on the far end of the pier waving a red flag at them. A lifeguard, a concerned bystander, someone giving them something to steer towards. What lunatic would be out in this? What lunatic would have his kid out in this? The wind is whipping in all directions now, the rain coming down even harder, the swells higher. Man and boy rowing harder on the back end of each wave and being surfed forward on the front ends. The man looks back and spies his son keeping pace. Why did I drag him out here today, he wonders. Because of the holiday? I know he really wanted to go with his mom and sister to the mall instead. I knew that at the time, and it ticked me off. I dragged him out here into nature, into the elements, because I know what's best for him. Ha, what a joke. What an ugly, cruel joke. He should be safe and dry in the mall, playing one of those Xbox games with his sister, and me out here by myself in nature and in the elements, about to be drowned or killed by a lightning strike. For the moment, the man cannot see Dolphin Island. It's gone. The pier, that person waving the red flag on the pier, all blotted out, all gone. Nothing but the torrential rain and the Gulf swells morphed into one gray, throbbing, enveloping mass. He stops rowing. He realizes that he's crying, sobbing now, his tears mixing in with the salt spray and the rainwater dousing his cheeks and beard. Oh, my wife, my daughter, he thinks. What were they wearing this morning? I can't even remember. I can't even see them. They've been blotted out as well. Lord, he prays again, thy will be done. Is this thy will? Are you kidding? A man and his boy murdered by you out upon the sea, like in yon Old Testament times. Lord, I cannot see that as your will, as your justice, as your love. I cannot see the island and the pier, and I cannot see my daughter and my wife, and I can't see all my days past, and I can't see this moment, and I can't see making it back to shore with my son, and I cannot see tomorrow or the next day back in the office to work on whatever it was I was working on that I cannot recall now, because I cannot see anything anymore except water, sea water. I see water. I see seawater by the seashore, but I cannot see the seashore for the seawater. Come on, it's the boy yelling, a piercing high-pitched voice cracking and changing between child and man. The boy has now moved ahead of his father and is now yelling back to him over thin sunburned shoulders. Come on, move it. The man blinks out of his dazed stupor. Water is sloshing over the front of his kayak as he sits, still not rowing. He sees the boy pumping his oars like a madman up and over the swells. The man begins rowing, and soon he catches up to his son. Thunder is still booming, but now it's off to the east. The swells are lower, and the downpour has slackened just a bit. He can see that fellow at the end of the pier, still waving a red flag and jumping up and down. They are close enough now that he can see it is a lifeguard, his neon yellow vest, his red flag waving. Just a boy himself, really, a teenager. The wind has died down, the rain softer. The man sees his son still ahead of him, rowing like an Olympic athlete towards the shore. The lifeguard boy is even closer now. He's jumping up and down on the pier, waving his red flag and laughing. Thank you, everybody.
That was wonderful, Harold. Wow,
Hope you
that was
enjoyed-
great.
I hope you enjoyed it. Turn it over to Alex now, or Becky rather. So thank you.
Great. Well, that was great. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So next we have Alex Z Salinas. He's the author of poetry collection Warbles and Dreamt, or the Lingering Phantoms of Equinox. He's also the author of a book of stories, City Lights from the Upside Down, from San Antonio Review Press, which we are celebrating tonight. He holds an MA in English Literature and Language from St. Mary's University and lives in San Antonio, Texas. Alex?
Thank you, Becky. Just want to say thanks to Malvern Books, Becky and Joe for hosting Whit and I. And Whit, that was It's an honor to be reading with you again. Great song. I just also wanted to shout out to Daily Workers' new LP, My Heavens. Check it out, y'all. Just look it up, My Heavens. It's great music. Yeah, thanks to all the family and friends that are here tonight. Appreciate your time, and get started. Just read a few stories from City Lights from the Upside Down. Shout out again to SAR Press, San Antonio Review Press, for putting our work out there. So the first story I will read is Coke Machine. Coke Machine. Milton Brown made his way to the far end of the mall, the side with the Sears with the busted sign that read SAR, and began his routine. He dunked his mop in the yellow bucket filled with murky water, twisted the handle. Milton swung his mop in circles, producing large, glossy swirls on the dark tile. This was entertainment for him. He wasn't the type of man to bring an iPod to work, not even a CD player. He believed he was too old for that mess. After a while of swishing the mop around, imagining it as the girl he never took to the prom he never went to, Milton noticed a woman on her hands and knees by the Coke machine near the glass exit doors. She seemed to be looking for something, dropped money perhaps. From where he stood, Milton couldn't see her face, only a tangle of curly blonde hair. The mall wouldn't close for another 2 hours, but still, Milton wasn't used to seeing people on the far end this time of night. The hell's she up to? Milton muttered. He continued mopping, but kept glancing at the woman every few seconds. It seemed to Milton that she wasn't looking for something, but rather waiting for something. Overcome, Milton decided to approach her and find out. He walked to her slowly so as to not startle her. Can I help you with something, ma'am? He asked. His voice seemed to echo in the empty mall. The woman shot her head up at Milton. She was young, very young. There was a jagged pink scar on her cheek, and she wore a silver necklace with a small cross, a Christian. Milton thought he figured out the crazed look in her bloodshot blue eyes. There's a portal under here, the young woman said. A what? A portal to the Pemberton vault with all the secrets. If I can get my hands on the recipes, I'll be rich, super rich. Milton scratched his balding head and wondered who the hell Pemberton was. Then he realized it didn't matter. This woman was whacked out, far gone in another world. But Milton didn't judge these kinds of people. He understood their situation. That's because long ago, Milton lost his only brother to drugs. His older brother, Troy, got mixed up with bad people and eventually got himself killed. A gunshot to the head, blew all his brains out. That's how Milton remembered him. For a good while, Milton too was mixed up in that world, a world he felt he had inherited. Like his older brother, he too once found himself on the business end of a gun, pointed right at his temple, all because he'd shortchanged a bad-tempered distributor named Keith $10. As Milton was on his knees before Keith, hands locked behind his head, execution style, he thought about Troy, then closed his eyes and wept. Keith, seeing Milton weep like a child, felt a surge of power spread through his body. This is what it feels like to be a god, Keith thought. I am a god. He loved the feeling of making a weak man get on his knees and beg for his life. Keith let Milton live, but said the next time he saw him, he'd better have his $100 ready because that was the new price for his life. The next day, as Milton wandered the streets, feeling sick to his stomach, wondering how the hell he was going to scrounge up cash, he stumbled into a building where a non-denominational Christian service was taking place. Milton figured dropping in for a few minutes wouldn't hurt. He could use some uplifting. He stayed for the whole service. He was enthralled by Pastor James, who stood straight and talked straighter. After the service ended, Milton walked up to Pastor James and talked to him. Milton confessed everything, his life's problems and addictions. Pastor James, with calmness in his mind, listened without interrupting. When Milton finished, the pastor told him to hang on a minute, then walked off somewhere. When he returned, he held a $100 bill in front of Milton. He said, "Use this to get yourself out of trouble, son." Milton's knees trembled. He couldn't believe the pastor's kindness. All he'd wanted to do was talk. Milton felt like crying, getting on his knees again and crying. Instead, He accepted the Benjamin, stuffed it in his pocket, and asked, "Will you be here tomorrow?" Pastor James smiled and answered, "Yes." And like that, Milton took a step toward freedom away from the bad world, a world that, as a minimum wage janitor in a crumbling mall, felt vaguely familiar to him upon seeing the strange, drugged up young blonde. "I'm Milton," Milton said to the woman, bending down and extending his hand to her. At first, she stared at his hand like it was a knife, but then she understood the gesture and shook it. "Want to help me look for the portal?" the woman asked. "We'll split the money." "Oh, that's okay, darling. I appreciate it," Milton replied, smiling faintly. He didn't know what else to say. Milton recently read in the papers how a new drug from Florida called Clark Kent was sweeping across the nation. Kids were injecting the stuff into their feet, and for a few hours it made them feel invincible, like they could fly, like Superman. But then came the hallucinations, the cravings, then death. The drug was killing them and killing them fast. Milton wondered if this young woman on the ground before him was on Clark Kent. "Too bad, so sad then," the woman said blandly. "More money for me." "What's your name, darling?" "Susanna." Susanna lowered her head to the floor and resumed her search underneath the Coke machine. "I'm gonna find it," she said, her voice directed under the machine. "Then I'm gonna be rich, super rich." There was no rhyme or reason for people in Susanna's condition, Milton thought. She was already gone. "I know you will, darling. I know it." Milton got back on his feet. The truth was, he wanted to help Susanna. Maybe it was her age or the fact that she was a woman, or that he saw something of himself in her. Milton briefly considered offering to take her home for a hot meal and a warm bed so she could get right, but then he wondered how that could work. It wasn't possible. It changed up too many things. Plus, Milton didn't know Susanna at all, didn't know her history or the kinds of people she hung with. The idea of taking in a complete stranger in this day and age was straight up crazy. Perhaps if Milton was younger, a young buck, as Pastor James had called him, he'd have thought otherwise, but now he had to think about himself, the rest of his life, an older man. Milton walked away from Susanna as slowly as he came. The next 4 days, as Milton made his way to the far end of the mall, he saw Susanna by the Coke machine, peeking underneath it, searching for her portal. She became part of his routine landscape. Somehow, seeing her comforted him. On the third day, Milton called out to Susanna. "Still looking, darling?" "I'm gonna find it. You'll see," Susanna answered. "Then I'm gonna be rich, super rich." "I know you will, darling. You'll find it." On day 5, Milton decided, what the hell? He'd join Susanna in her search. He'd get on all fours, even if just for a few minutes, help out. It wouldn't hurt, and sometimes it's beneficial to change things up. When Milton got to the far end of the mall, he found that Susanna wasn't there. This deflated him. The sensation was like arriving at the movie theater, only to find out the movie you were dying to see is sold out. Still, during his mopping, Milton couldn't help but glance at the Coke machine every now and then. Foolishly, he hoped, like a child, that Susanna would materialize. The next night, when Milton saw that Susanna was still gone, worry set in. Perhaps she was in some alley, on the ground in the fetal position by a dumpster, a needle stuck in her heel. Milton didn't want to think about that, but he couldn't help it. He quickly became angry with himself. This showed in his work as he pushed the mop around roughly. He was ashamed. He pondered all the things he could have said and all the things he could have done. After everything Pastor James had done for him, this was how he returned the favor? Asshole, thought Milton of himself. You selfish asshole. Later, calmed down, Milton wondered what it was that made people better versions of themselves in their heads. This was a question that had no right or wrong answers. The next day, his day off, Milton decided to do something he hadn't done in 7 years as a mall janitor. Go to the mall. He made his way to the far end and his heart pumped like crazy. The night before, Milton had had a dream that Troy took him to shoot hoops at Miller Park. Troy commanded, all serious, "Let's roll." Then he jumped and flew off like a crow, as a crow. Milton stood stunned on the court. He stared at the gray sky and accepted the absurdity of it all. When he woke up, Milton hopped out of bed and splashed cold water on his face. Unsettled, he thought of the dream as an omen. Pastor James had convinced him long ago that all dreams, one way or another, were omens, visions from God or hell. When Milton approached the red glow, the Coke machine, and no Susanna, his anxiety flushed out of him in an ugly way. Waste of time, he muttered. Omens my ass. Milton looked at the busted Sears sign. Now that he was here, he thought about walking inside the store, but there wasn't a thing he wanted to buy. He felt out of place all of a sudden, and now all he wanted to do was get out of Dodge. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten anything all day. His headspace made sense, knowing his mood was tied to his eating. Before he left, Milton decided to grab pretzel bites and a soda. Staring at the Coke machine, Milton couldn't recall the last time he'd bought a soda from a machine. He spotted something shiny on the ground near the machine. He bent down and picked up a silver necklace with a small cross. Susanna's, or one just like hers. Milton wondered if she was aware she dropped it, but then realized that was a ridiculous thing to think. Crouched, Milton then got on all fours and lowered his face to the floor. The tile was cold against his cheek. He knew he was acting impulsive, a little nuts, but he couldn't care less. Nobody was at the mall. Under the Coke machine was nothing, just dark and darkness, just dust and darkness. Milton wondered, what does a portal look like anyway? Big or small? Do they make loud noises, or are they as silent as cemeteries? Do they have blue energy rings around them, or are they invisible? Where do they lead to? Worlds with purple skies and red oceans and little green men, or inside huge vaults filled with gold bars and secret recipes? As Milton stared into the darkness, he heard the hum of the machine. It was a sound he'd never really listened to before. It could put him to sleep if he listened long enough. A short while later, Milton got back on his feet. His knees and lower back were achy. Still clasping the silver cross necklace, which felt sweaty in his hands, he stuffed it inside his pocket. He left the mall, and on the walk back to his truck, he thought, you're too old for this, too old. On the drive home, Milton couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt as if something small but important, like an old lever, had been cranked inside him in the opposite direction. He was on edge. He smacked his lips and tasted metal, bitterness. His tongue was bone dry. He'd forgotten to get food. All that mess about portals had made him forget. His stomach growled again, and the only thing Milton could do was groan. He squeezed his old leathery steering wheel until veins emerged on the top of his hands like wild black tentacles. Thank you all.
That was great. That was wonderful, Alex. Are you going to read another one, or is that what you have tonight?
I have two more. The last one's super short. The next one's, they're both pretty short. Next
Okay,
one's
no, that's great. That's great.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
I just didn't know. That was wonderful. That was really
Oh,
very, very engrossing. Great.
thank you. And shout out to Schlock, called Schlock Magazine. They're a publication out of the UK, Britain, London, England. They were the ones that published the first version of that story. So shout out. This next one is the title story, City Lights from the Upside Down. And all I can say is it was inspired by the summer near the end of my undergraduate years. I worked in an insurance, worked in a call center for an insurance company, and it was July 5th. And all day I was telling people on the phone, Happy 4th of July at the end, until one guy next to me said, hey, you know, it's July 5th, right? We had a big laugh about that. And like art, literature, stories, like it came to me much later to write about it, and it became something else. So City Lights from the Upside Down. Walking into work, I munched on a Quaker Chewy chocolate chip granola bar, swigged the last drops of hot Aquafina water that boiled overnight in my car. San Antonio, July 2010, Hell's Kitchen Sink. Not a nice place for a white Mexicant like me, for anybody with epidermis, really. Walking into work, I remember thinking, I'll be in Boston this time next year sipping hot chocolate. Dragging my feet through the glass door with a huge blue N embossed on it, I remember thinking, when are you gonna actually apply to grad school? Cora, My insurance training buddy for 3 months, beautiful Cora, her heart-shaped face I won't soon forget, smiled at me as I passed her in the break room. She too was 21, but was 3 years behind in college. She'd had a kid, baby daddy problems, as the kids said. In those days, I worked in a call center because, look, how could I know then just how badly my private loans would rip my ass up later on? Absorbed in the present, at the time, it was as if the future awaited me like a salaried paycheck, my name ink dried and saved in the servers. The things they never tell you, the berserk nature of thoughts that flit across your mind in a stuffed cubicle, the brain fry of buzzing fluorescent office lights, the rigid impracticality of Payless dress shoes bending your aching arches, the advent of Murphy's Law and the foibles of fallible insurance policies. Me, I kept busy, chewed my fingernails to bloody stubs, lived in the present and such. When are you off today? Whispered Enrique, whom I could hear but not see. We were siloed, he and I, by a gray wall divider, two soft core cell inmates. What time do you show? I said. Say again? Hey, I said, want to grab lunch today? There's that little mom and pop Thai joint down the road. To be honest, I'm sick and tired of Wendy's. Sorry, bro, Enrique said. Already ate. It's like 3 o'clock, dude. We never did go out to lunch, Enrique and me. I recall his spectacled face, large and folded, caramel like desert sand. I could be mixing him up with someone else. That's very possible. It's getting harder and harder to tell. In addition to my fingers, I constantly chewed big red gum. I'd always been hyper aware of my breath, even when talking to client strangers on the phone. Remember, this was before I began to regularly floss. There existed somewhere a company policy about not chewing gum while on the job. However, when young, brash, and a self-proclaimed Marxist as I was, in my daydreams at least, the rules slide off you like rain. Speaking of torrential storms, one day I got soaked on my walk into work. I was a 21-year-old guy, therefore had found it useless to own my own umbrella. No umbrella and coached in insurance. There's a first-rate joke there I'll write down someday. I left home before long. I didn't wait to catch cold from the downstream blast of air conditioning directly above my desk. I didn't alert my supervisor. No more funny business, he warned me the next day. It was only because he'd known my older cousin in high school, they'd played varsity basketball together, that he didn't fire me on the spot. I nodded and he nodded back. We fist bumped. He must have really believed he was doing me a solid. Funny business. Who did he think I was, Kermit the Frog? If you want to force your discovery of poetry, and I mean in an exceptionally exceptional way, follow after me. Answer the endless phone calls, lose track of them, even if the man doesn't, even if just for a short while. If you're interested, I'll send you the link to apply, though it's been over a decade since I've set foot inside that old brick building. I know I'll never do so again. Here's how I eventually came to imagine the downtown San Antonio skyline. Jagged row of bottom teeth meets toothless blue chasm, as in so wide open, how else does 9/11 happen? As in so wide open, how else can birds fly? The sun, erstwhile supreme Marxist, bakes us, his restless comrades, his faithful sons and daughters. I should mention now that I took Cora out on 2 dates, both times to Mi Tierra on a Friday evening after work, after which the second date we mutually decided without using our words that things weren't going to work out between us. That's how I remember it, at least. It's very likely it shook out that way. It's getting harder and harder to tell. After our second outing, we hugged goodbye. She smelled great. And later I'd rationalized that if I was the universe and the universe was me, I was nearly 14 billion years old, and my collision with Cora was nearly 14 billion years in the making. And the sad truth is the payoff doesn't match the anticipation, not by a long shot. One day, while in the office, like the sour aftertaste of mustard and dill pickle relish haunting my tongue, I took a call and assisted a lien holder, exactly as written, easy as pie. To memory, it's the smoothest call I've ever been paid to answer. At the end of our brief transaction, The lien holder expressed satisfaction at my superb customer service. I replied to him, "Happy 4th of July," after which I immediately realized my embarrassing mistake, then amended myself, "Happy 5th of July." Enrique laughed so loud, our gray wall divider juddered, knocking down the only adornment I tacked up on my side, a Polaroid of our soon-to-be deceased family golden retriever, Attaboy, which landed in my trash bin. "Happy 5th of July, Enrique repeated. "Man, that's some original shit right there. Where do you come up with this material?" "I got it from my mama," I replied stoically, thinking of the song by will.i.am. Enrique informed me he'd worked in insurance for 8 years. 8 long years, he added. 8 years sure is a long ass time, was all I managed to say back to him before I hopped on another call. I should also mention that that summer, which launched the beginning of a 2-year citywide drought, that for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, a bright light, not quite star and not quite angel, followed me home at night. Wherever I'd fix my gaze, so too there it was. I made the error of mentioning it to Cora on our second and last rendezvous, and judging from the expression in her swollen eyes, I knew she believed me to be another magical thinker, a man of myth and fiction, too untethered from her gritty realm of baby daddies. I was not yet a father. I couldn't understand, and consequently, I was on the other side. I asked to see another photo of her daughter. She said her phone had died. Oh, the ferocious irony of meter and rhyme. It was only later, much later, when I immortalized that unforgettable alien presence in a poetry collection I had published last year, my first book titled City Lights from the Upside Down. My publisher in Los Angeles had recommended I consider downside up instead of upside down, pointing out that some readers, especially younger ones, may anticipate a connection to the hit Netflix show Stranger Things. I wrote him back in an email, "I've never watched the show. Plus, city lights from the downside up implies normal field vision. Nothing too extraordinary, no?" Although, I concluded in mock humility, I'm not at all suggesting my book will be extraordinary. Not at all. To date, I've sold 199 copies, performed 5 readings at used bookstores and public library basements. But really, who's counting? I'm serious. That wasn't a rhetorical question. I ask again, who's really keeping the score? Thank you. And got one more for y'all. This one's really personal to me. So this one, oh, and shout out to Mystery Tribune, who published the first version of that story. And this last one is pretty much one of the last stories I'd written that made it into this collection, and short, and it's in memory of my my maternal grandmother. Bread and Bologna. The last time I saw her as she was, not the very last time, for that would come later, when her mind had long abandoned her, she fixed me a bologna sandwich, nothing else inside. The bread and meat were fresh, and she so thin I wondered when she'd last fed herself. When Grandpa was still alive, this was well after his final sortie in the Cessna, whose scraps, I dream, are strewn from Mexico to Mount Rushmore in the shape of Our Lady of Guadalupe. We used to say his stomach, his panza, resembled a gigantic elephant's. Our family was the kind to deploy redundant adjectives. "This is delicious," I said one bite in, a small white lie. "Did I ever tell you about my father, a brilliant businessman and orator?" my grandmother asked. "Not really," I answered, a huge white lie. "He'd do people's taxes for free. He taught them how to speak English. He was a good, smart man. All the brains you have, you get it from my side. Don't you ever forget it," my grandmother said, before 10 minutes passed and she asked me again about her father, the man to whom I owe my intelligence. The patience I retain in memory recall and writing poetry, for I squandered my late 20s studying for an English literature degree, I severely lack in real life. A little girl once approached me in a cafe and asked what I was reading. I looked up, spotted her beautiful mother smiling at me, and with a shaking knee, I answered the child, just a tiny book. Some days, especially under bright, clear skies, I find the sound of acoustic guitar emotionally exhausting. Not detestable, but draining. I can't say how, I don't know why. It's like my life happens only to become somebody else's story. My best friend from high school had said months before he enlisted in the Marines and got blown up in Afghanistan. Yep, was all I could muster in reply. It's sad, this whole enterprise, maddening, but also, quite often, drop dead gorgeous. Face it, admit it, there's no story here. 18 months as of this scribbling embroiled in a global pandemic, there's no story here. What I feel mostly for myself. What I write mostly for myself, so that death may compress me into a flashing thought, a stranger's briefest interest. My name, my words, learn and understand them, or I am a war machine trapped in this period, condensed by the laws of physics, the logic of grammar, and this one. Kiss them, release me. If I could go back, I'd lie to my grandmother so much better. Instead of delicious, I'd call her last bologna sandwich scrumptious, the best sandwich ever. Something ridiculous. Then I'd pick up all the crumpled tissues of Kleenex she tossed behind her sofa, along with her wedding band, and gently place the ring back on her slender finger. Did I ever tell you about my father? She would ask. Not really, I would lie. But this exercise, we know, is tampering with evidence, disrespectful. And I like to believe I behave respectfully toward the dead.
That was wonderful. That was just great. So I don't know if I don't see any specific questions here, but I was interested that both of y'all had kind of a situation where you've been writing poetry and now you both are doing short stories. So what I want to know is, is this like a, was this kind of a decision y'all got together and made, or, what was it?
Yeah, it was planned, sure.
I figured. What drew you to it, each of you?
I'll let you go with. Oh,
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. No, the funny thing is that I was actually writing stories first. I felt like that was like my bread and butter. And then I kind of got drawn to poetry. And then ironically, poetry, like 2 poetry books came out first. So then I was introduced artistically to the world as a poet. Then I had this like cognitive dissonance in my head. Like I never felt comfortable being called a poet for whatever reason, till one day someone just said, you are a poet, you are a writer, you're an author, you're all, you can be all the things. And I don't know why I was trying to box myself into just being something else. So no, it just, for me, it just worked out this way.
Yeah, kind of similar with me. I would have tried writing stories first, poetry later in maybe college afterwards, and then eventually into songwriting and mostly just sticking with music, returning to poetry, and then finding that the poem itself, I wanted more. I wanted to dig deeper, and I've even attempted a longer story, and I'm not quite there. Alex, I don't know if do you have a novel in the works? Is that something you're
Yeah.
working on?
Yeah, in basically like January of 20, so right before the pandemic started, I started working on a short novel. I just finished it in April of 2020. So it took about 1.5 years. It totally kicked my butt. But it is about a guy who, Becky, your question, it's about well, it's a lot of things, but it is about a man who was a short story writer who becomes a poet. And, there's a murder in there. It's overly probably philosophical. It's all these, he changes his identity. So it's a weird one. It's like it goes into the work.
Sounds like Malvern Books kind of book. Especially if it's sad. We do a lot with sad.
Alex, did you, there's a story where you, I can't remember the title, but one of your, in the new book, you see Spurs shooting coach Chip England. That happened, I'm sure, right? That had to have happened. That's based on a.
Yeah, there's a story in the book called Chipped. And I actually did. So I would say like of the 40 stories in this book, and it's not a long book, so a lot of the short stories are really short. Like a handful are like the last two that I read are really quite autobiographical. But the one that Whit's asking about, I did one day go into a Barnes and Noble, maybe sometime within the last 2 years, and I saw Chip England, who was like the shooting coach for the San Antonio Spurs. And like, when I was in pretty much from middle school to high school and even in college, huge Spurs fan, played a lot of basketball. I used to get called Manu on the basketball court, like when he was, light skin, dark hair, Hispanic, it was just like easy association. So I was like a huge Spurs fan. And when I saw Chip England, who's like obscure beyond, basketball like fans, I just like had this moment of like, I've watched this man work on the jump shot of Tony Parker, Tim Duncan, and my mind just went racing. And there he was. I just saw him like, I was just going like, what kind of books does Chip England get drawn to? And that's when the author takes over. And I had no idea it would become kind of a sad love story.
I was going to ask, did you see any of the other guys? Did you see any of the superstars around? Did that would have been a story too, I'm sure, I guess. No,
my luck is always like these obscure, like for me, it's a star, but it's like to everyone else, like no one, very few people probably know who Chip England was off the name. Yeah, so no, I haven't seen any, of them.
Yeah, that's right.
It looks like, let's see, from Jennifer, Alex and Harold, you both use and discuss music in your approaches to storytelling. How does that different medium drive your writing process?
Okay, I'll go first, I guess. I've been playing music a lot longer than I was attempting to write. Not about the same, I guess, but I'm way more adept at music, at guitar. I'm a guitarist first and foremost. So writing, I guess how it translates into the poetry, I don't know. I don't really think about it much. It's the musicality of the phrasing, the language, internal rhyming and such within poetry. And then of course with the short stories, like Alex was mentioning, they're pretty much autobiographical. It's you're writing about yourself and what you've. And so the short stories are in Mel Bay, a lot of rock and roll themed and early childhood memories growing up in the church in small town in Alabama, in Muscle Shoals. My dad was a retired choir director, so I was around a lot of choral music and religious music as well as secular. So that definitely informed me. But as far as the writing itself, two separate things. When I'm writing, there's no music. It's just the words. And likewise with music. So I'm trying to combine the two, trying to bring poetry into my lyrics. But it's I don't know. Maybe I'll get to that at some point where it's seamless. But at this point, they're pretty separate. Alex, what do you think?
That's a great answer with like not thinking about it. That's like my first, like I don't think about it, but I guess like in the story you asked me about, or the one I talked about, Chip England inspired it. Like in that story, I remember I referenced a song by Dusty Springfield. And what was that one? I can't even remember the song, but I guess in doing that, when I hear, in fact, even before this reading, I was listening to a couple of Coltrane albums, like to sort of, when I first started writing even stories and certainly poetry, I would listen to certain, like typically jazz, like at home. And I love finding those, like Coltrane for me is a great muse, to where it's like I hear it and there's an urgency in some of his music that feels like poetry to me. And whenever, like, that's how I approach poetry, is, and even some of the fiction is like there's an urgency, and I only write these days when I feel like an urgency to write. I never force it. It's not like I wake up every day going, okay, I'm gonna knock out some words today. I just never force it. I've just learned when I do that, I hate whatever I write. And so I only write when it's like bubbling up. And maybe that's for me why I do reference a lot of music, not particularly these batch that I read, but in other stories. And certainly, in fact, the second poetry book I had, the Dreamt or the Lingering Phantoms of Equinox, there's a, that was inspired by John Coltrane, like the equinox part. And so it's so intertwined to what I do. And, you know, it's not like I'm over here trying to appropriate like jazz and, you know, like I listen to it. And to me, it's like art, writing / poetry and music. They're like the three, they're always in dance. I believe that they should talk to each other. And like Malvern books, when I go there, so many of the Malvern books that I see, like the writers that I like and gravitate towards, they understand that art, like books make other books, you know, books come out of other books. And that's just how I feel. So I will listen to a song like Dusty Springfield and I'm like, I'm going to squeeze this into this story that I'm working in. I'm going to work it in there because it's urgent. That's my uneducated answer.
That's great. Well, it's almost 8 o'clock and I don't see that we have any other questions, but what a wonderful event. I really enjoyed, I know we all did. I'm sure we all did, hearing your stories. They're just fantastic. And I really wanted Susanna to find that portal, and I'm hoping she did. And she just lost her necklace when she went down, you know, it just got slipped off. And so that's what I'm thinking. And I'm glad they made it back to the father and son made it back to the shore okay in their kayaks. I was very nervous about them. So y'all, really got me going. And but it was wonderful. Thank y'all so much. And I appreciate everyone joining us tonight. Thank you so much. We had a great crowd. And as we mentioned, we do have Harold and Alex's books at Malvern Books. We're happy to see you at the store.